Welcome to ENG 303, Study Session 12, Relative Constructions. We have discussed the making of complex sentences in Chapter 8. There we saw the different forms of complex sentences such as the non-finite clause, the noun clause, and the adverbial clause. However, because the formation of relative or adjectival clause is more complex than those of the previous clauses, we have decided to discuss it in detail. Hence, this lecture will be devoted solely to relative clauses. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to 1. Distinguish between main clause and dependent clause, construct relative constructions, explain the derivation of relative constructions, and distinguish between different derived relative constructions. Pre-test. 1. What is a relative construction? How are relative constructions formed? What rules are applied? Content. The relative clause is also called the adjectival clause in traditional grammar. It's a subordinate clause which requires an antecedent. In this lecture, we explore the characteristics of relative clauses and explain the processes of forming subordinate relative clauses. We also look at the conditions that favor the insertion of the relative clause and the rules that apply before we can realize the surface structure. Relative constructions. Embedded or subordinative relative clauses were initially the independent simple sentences. When they are to be inserted into another sentence, they require an NP which is identical with an NP in the host sentence. Such NP can be the subject, the object of the verb, or the object of preposition in the sentence. When the subordinate clause shares the same NP with the host, the identical NP can also be the subject or object of the embedded sentence. Under identity condition, the identical INP in the embedded NP has its NP changed to a relative pronoun, which shares identical syntactic features with the initial NP. For instance, if the NP is animate and functions as subject, the relative pronoun is who. For object, it is whom, and for possessive, it is whose. If it is inanimate, it is realized as which in subject and object positions, and who is in the possessive form positions. Notice too that more than one relative clause can occur in a sentence. The major condition for creating a relative clause is the existence in the host sentence of an NP which will serve as its antecedent. When the relative pronoun is formed, it leaves its original position and moves to the comp position. The comp position occurs at the beginning of the embedded clause. In this sense, the relative pronoun moves there to serve as a link or a clause introducer to the main clause. The moved WH word leaves a trace which is co-indexed with it. In the process of analysis, all the other components of the sentence are analyzed to the word level, and the affixed hoping rule is applied to facilitate the realization of the surface structure. The following schema, which shall be used to analyze different relative structures, has been adapted from Yusuf, 1990 to 92. The schema shows that the embedded clause must be attached to an NP. The embedded clause should also have an NP which will be moved into comp. However, this NP must share similar semantic features with the NP on the main clause. It is this similarity of features that caused the second NP to change to a relative clause. Let us exemplify with some sentences. Consider the following. 1. The fire which Alimi kindled spread very quickly. This is a complex sentence. To explain how we realize it, we'll first take the clause apart as follows. 2. The fire, Alimi kindled the fire, spread very quickly. Notice that the embedded clause is enclosed in square brackets, and the fire, which is the object of the verb kindled, is identical with the subject of the main sentence. It means, therefore, that the fire in the embedded clause will change to which because it is inanimate and move into comb as in the following 3 diagrams. As the diagram shows, the subordinate clause is embedded under the subject NP and is therefore part of the NP. Again, it is a clause on its own. We expanded it to become a full sentence so that we can get the true picture of its components before transformations applied to it. From this, we realize that the object NP of the subordinate clause is identical with the subject NP of the matrix clause. This is the link that facilitated the attachment of the insert into the main clause. When transformations apply, the following diagram results. Surface structure. The fire which Alimi kindled spread very quickly. As you can see from this diagram, the only major transformation is the change of the NP, the fire, to which, and the movement of this to the comb position. Notice that the movement leaves a trace and both are co-indexed. Note too that the two elements which and T form a chain, and which is the head of the chain and T the tail. Here is another set of sentences for further analysis. A. I know the man who won the prize. B. Joy beat the boy whose friend we saw. C. They put the book on the shelf which he bought. For sentence A, the deep structure is as follows. I know the man won the prize. We can now put it on a tree diagram as follows. In this diagram, we can see that the subordinate clause is attached to the NP object. Again, the subject of the clause is identical with the antecedent, which happens to be the object of the main verb. So, it is expected that the subject of the subordinate clause will be changed to a relative pronoun, which will be moved into comb. This is exactly what happened, as the following surface structure analysis shows. Surface structure. I know the man who won the prize. Since the identical NP in the embedded sentence is animate, and since it is the subject of the embedded clause, it changes to who. This WH word then moves into comb, leaves a trace at the extraction site, and is co-indexed with the trace. We apply the affix open rule and arrive at the surface structure, which is a relative construction. The final sentence we want to analyze is 9. Joy beat the boy whose friend we saw. The deep structure is Joy beat the boy, we saw the boy's friend. To know the items which make up the deep structure, we draw a tree diagram. The major difference between this structure and the previous ones is that it has a possessive element. The relevant NP in the main clause is the boy, which is replicated in the object position of the embedded clause as the boy's friend. As usual, the process of changing this structure to a relative clause is through changing the identical item in the embedded clause into a relative pronoun. This time around, we have to take cognizance of the existence of the possessive element. In this sense, when we change the boy into a relative pronoun, we need to look for the relative pronoun that shows possession. Thus, our choice will be whose. The next step is to move the relative pronoun into comb. However, because whose contains an element of possession, it will take along with it the remaining part of the NP. Hence, whose friend will be moved into the same comb together. After movement, a trace is left behind and both the trace and the moved element are co-indexed. Furthermore, the affixed open rule will be applied to arrive at the surface structure. The result of these permutations is reflected in the analysis below. Surface structure. Joy beats the boy whose brother we saw. Summary. In this last lecture, we have looked at the formation of relative clauses. We studied different structures and how to analyze them. We identified different relative pronouns, principally who, whom, which, and whose, and how they are realized in different contexts. We have come to the end of study section 12. Thanks for listening.